Welcome to the Homeschool Together podcast. Where one working mom and a stay-at-home dad help you navigate the nuts and bolts of the growing and dynamic world of homeschooling.
With a focus on early learners, like me.
All the ins and outs of building and maintaining your homeschool life.
Homeschool.
Find out tips and tricks to make things like this easier.
I'm reading.
And ultimately, enjoy educating your kids. And what's that last thing?
Have fun together. Did I do good, Daddy?
Yeah, you did, sweetie. Good job. Hello, friends and families, and welcome back to Homeschool Together. Thank you for joining us. If you have a chance, head down into the show notes and click all the links and do all the things and share the podcast if you can. Today, we're going to be starting a two-part episode. We came off of a three-part episode. We're going in the two-part episode, reverse Fibonacci here. The next episode will be, we're going to kind of like how to expand on this topic, but we're going to be talking about the 4-year history cycle. This is... Right. You know, if you're out there, and this will be oddly specific, say you're a homeschool dad and you have 2 children and you have a wife that does all the planning, you may be so in the weeds. You have never heard of the 4-year history cycle. I don't know who that might be. But luckily, Ariel is going to be here to talk about it, to help you figure it out. And then what we're going to do is next week talk about how to teach the 4-year home history cycle to multiple children.
I'm going to just like count how many times you say 4-year home history.
4-year homeschool cycle. You know, we only do the homeschooling for 4 years. It's very efficient. And then we kick them out and send them to the salt mines to go do something. But anyway, so Ariel, biggest question. What is the 4-year homeschool cycle?
So when we started using Build Your Library, one of the things that they ran on was this 4-year history cycle. And I've been asked questions from people like, well, how would we adapt it? We've got multiple kids. And so we thought this 2-part episode would be really helpful. So in basic, now there are, I guess I should preface this by saying there are variations on all these things, and you will find different people who reference a 4-year history cycle that's a little bit different, or a 6-year history cycle. Like there are options, but
the 4 years and the 6 years at war.
Yeah, in basic, it's a cycle where you start with ancient history, and then the next year you do Middle Ages and Renaissance, and then you do early modern, and the last year you do modern history. Okay. Some people will do like ancients, medieval, early modern, and then U.S. If you notice in Build Your Library, they do U.S. after this. So they would, kind of get into specifics after the standard 4-year. And
that would be the 5th year then?
Right.
Okay.
And then they're going to cycle back through it in the high school levels of Build Your Library. So the whole idea is that you're hitting on all these different time periods, not once, but multiple times to help your learners to grasp it at different levels. I mean, the whole concept is really that, it's all based in the trivium, right? So that grammar, logic, and rhetoric stages. So the younger children are just going to learn kind of, some facts, broad overview. Hey, we did ancient Egypt with our daughter last year, ancient civs, but let's just say ancient Egypt. That was like the first time that we'd gotten into it. So she's learning kind of broad brushstrokes. Who were these people? Who were the ancient Sumerians? Who were the Babylonians? It's just kind of getting an overview. When we go back through it as an older student, then we're in the logic stage of being able to analyze and look at causes and effects and really understand a kind of deeper level about the subject we're studying. And then once we get into high school, we're ready to really start making arguments about historical events and really evaluating them and forming some opinions about what happened in that deeper level. So the idea is that you're like taking different cuts into history rather than just saying, hey, we're going to just study this one time in your entire education and you're going to have to formulate all your thoughts about it right now. I know that the level of understanding that our first grader had about ancient civs is going to be vastly different than our 7th grader when she's that age, and vastly different than a senior in high school. So that's kind of the idea, is that you would cycle between them. Well,
and it's interesting because on that first cycle, you do hit like kind of modern times when the child is a little bit older and they're not like that first grade level. They'll be more like a 5th grade level. You can talk more depth there because the modern times would probably be more important for them to have contextual understanding of, what they're experiencing now with respect to maybe 50, 100 years ago, as opposed to 5,000 years ago.
There's also the closer you get to modern times as well, there's more documentation. Like I can't imagine studying World War II with a small child with all the pictures, and some of it's very graphic, or Vietnam, or I mean some of these big wars. I would just be like, wow, that would be really hard to study with a younger child. So some of the benefits of having the cycle are it's a logical and sequential learning process. It really helps kids connect with historical events over time. You know, you're kind of moving chronologically, but you're doing it in these phases, and it's just provides a nice framework to break up, human history. So,
well, it's a huge they're huge pieces. I mean, it's hard to, like, I know with the ancient civilizations that we did was about 36, 39 weeks or something like that, somewhere in that range. That was a lot of work. It was a lot of reading. It was a lot of, learning different areas to keep them all together. It's
great. It's a first time to expose our kids to it and build their curiosity. I would say that our daughter definitely, I mean, our younger one was kind of in tow. She was 4, so she got some of it. But I would say for our older daughter, who was 8 at the time, I think it definitely helped her. It was a springboard, if anything. I don't feel like she would say she knows everything about ancient Egypt. I think it built enough curiosity in her that she would definitely want to learn more when she was older, so that, when we do it again, she can gain a deeper understanding of it, and eventually can be at more of an adult level to, really analyze, have debates. What do we think about this or that? And you can always up the level of books and things. So that's kind of nice.
So when we're thinking about this kind of 4-year history cycle, what are the kind of the benefits of homeschooling, like adaptability and things like that?
Yeah. So this 4-year history cycle works really well with your classical education curriculums or classical education philosophy, obviously. Your Charlotte Mason literature base, which is why Build Your Library does this, and Torchlight's kind of following along and doing that same cycle.
Okay.
There are other curriculums that do it too. So you can do this if you're an eclectic homeschooler. You can do it if you're following a curriculum. Just because you don't want to use one of those, you could still do a 4-year history cycle if that speaks to you. It's great because you can incorporate living books and projects and things. I mean, studying history is always, it's so rich. There's so much to do. So it's really going to be about finding the level that you're at and how much information you want to give so that, it's not overwhelming for our kids. But there's a lot of benefits, I think, to connecting with people through different areas of time. And if you haven't used History Book by Book from Emily Cook, that website, I think we mentioned it a couple podcasts ago. It's a fantastic resource to help you find living books, not just, you can find a million books written on Egypt, but like finding really high quality books.
Yeah, the curation process on that website is very good. What type of learning advantages do you get this as a family? Because you can take this and adapt it to multiple children. And we're going to talk about that in the next episode.
Yeah, you certainly can. I mean, I think you can do project-based learning, right? Everybody can be, doing pyramids at once or whatever it is. I'm going to keep going back to Egypt, and I apologize, you guys. It's just, it's like forefront of my mind because both our daughters are really into Egypt. But it's great too because it creates a continuity. It's a sense of progression. So it's something nice to do with multiple kids, and especially because they have resources at all the different levels, and there's projects at different levels. We talked about family learning. We talked about how, you can write size books and things for your different kids, but you could also do whole family projects, which are great too, whether we're trying to mold a sphinx or we're trying to draw on the wall the Hanging Gardens of Babylon or whatever it is, right? There's things that you can do project-based that can involve multiple ages. So I think history is nice. It can fill the space that you need it to, whereas, math or reading or something, it's harder. Everyone's kind of locked into their level.
Well, and I like that idea that you talked about where, the students are, following something through a progression of time. It makes sense going through this kind of linear move. Even though you may be hopping around the world, you are telling it in a timeline.
Right.
It makes sense.
It's like a story, right? Which is why I think, they called that Story of the World, but also when we did Ancient Times, the from Pandia Press, which what was that called? It was History Quest.
History Quest.
I'm sorry, History Quest.
So many books on the brain.
Yeah, we did History Quest, and that was told much like a story as well. I think there's so much great narrative that can flow through history, and it's nice to break up these kind of sections and say like, okay, here we're gonna talk about this whole. Otherwise, I think it could kind of flow together.
Yeah.
So kind of breaking it into these chunks is a nice way to go.
Now, there are a lot of people out there who will go this route, but are there any alternatives to this cycle?
So the idea with this is that you're going to do these and then, maybe you're going to do state or U.S. history or something at some point afterwards, and then you're going to cycle back through. Mm-hmm. But you only have so many years to do all of that. So like even in Build Your Library, they're not doing the 4-year history cycle 3 full times because they've got U.S. history for a couple of years. They have another geography in 7th grade and then history of science in 8th grade. Then they do the 4-year history cycle again in high school. So like that's only 2 passes through. So you've got to put a little bit of that middle school learning kind of into the high school level. If you were really following the classical education, you do it 3 times. So it can be a little bit challenging to get 3 full revolutions of it, and even Build Your Library doesn't. So that can be a challenge. One of the other challenges that you could have is you're going so quickly through that because you're going to hit it again. So the other option you could do is you could just do a chronological one-time pass. So you don't have to cycle through. If you wanted to do this in linear blocks, you would pick an age to start with, and maybe it doesn't have to be the super young ages, so that you could cover other social studies topics until you feel like your kids are ready. And then you could do a one-time pass, and you could just do a deep dive in it. And maybe they only cover Egypt once in 4th grade or something, or 5th grade, and you're cool with that because you're gonna move one time through, and you're going to take a lot longer with it and do a more in-depth.
So by the time they're in high school, they're doing modern history, maybe the last 300 or 400 years. Okay, that's interesting.
And if you want to spend more time and really just dive in and marinate in this subject and really kind of do it all, this would work out a lot better because you're not planning to pass through again. So one of these curriculums would maybe be a good springboard spot for you, but wouldn't be something that and now I like it in some ways because, you're getting to modern in high school where we talked about the subjects can be pretty tough, and you have a student who's old enough to be able to understand and can really discuss the things that have happened in the last couple hundred years.
It also gives you a lot of flexibility in that respect.
Totally.
If you choose to go through it one time, you can, pace yourself, and you can choose, what I'm going to deep dive into. You can go a little bit slower. Maybe read more books, get a little bit more depth in there. Yeah, I like that. You can pace yourself a little bit better.
Right. You could just say, hey, we're just going to move through once.
Or if you're going to consider doing it twice anyways, and maybe you don't want to do that kind of middle block where you're kind of just buying time.
Right. And that's what Build Your Library didn't. And you could decide.
You could do like a 6-year cycle, right? That type of thing.
Totally. And you could decide to cut out something like the history of science and the geography and just say, there is going to be a U.S. history component that goes in there. And in high school, usually U.S. history is a section. I remember in my high school, I think we had
ours was in high school, 10th grade, U.S. history.
Right. So U.S. history was one of the years, and then world history, and then government was a whole year.
Yeah.
Because that was separate from U.S. history. It was, and I think we had one. I think we may have had like 1 year of world, 2 years of American history, and then American government or something. So. Yeah. It's not exactly going to map perfectly to what they would do in like a public school. It can be a challenge. There's a couple of things with it. It can be a challenge for your younger students, especially to understand some of the concepts if you're only going to go through once. This time we had kind of this pass because we're like, hey, we know we're going to cover this again. So we'll just give them a pass at this information, which is at the level that they can understand and know that we will get to more later when they're older. Mm-hmm. If you're only going to go through once, then you might have to take more care with what you're going to teach, and some of the concepts might be too difficult for younger learners, but you get to go really in depth, and they might have much better memory and understanding of that. So, your mileage may vary.
So if they're not going to do the cycle, is there a way they can do like maybe unit studies and things like that?
Yeah, I think that's a great way to go. So rather than just go chronologically, you could just come up with great unit studies, and maybe you do an overview of all of the peoples of ancient civs or something, right? But maybe you just focus on a few. Or you focus on like inventions that change the world. It's all about inventions. It's irrespective of time, and you talk all about that. Or the history of medicine, or all about American civil rights, or whatever. And you could hop around history if that works. if you can maybe give your students kind of a through line overview, and then you pick sections out and deep dive, because at the end of the day, when they graduate high school, it's not like they're going to remember everything
Every
you
single
taught them,
thing.
right? We didn't. I mean, going to public, I went to public, you went to private.
Yep.
We didn't remember everything. The stuff that was most fresh was our American history and government stuff, but the rest of it, we had to do world history again in college. So it wasn't like...
Yeah, I mean, really, honestly, if you think about it, you're walking out with broad brushstrokes. You maybe
Totally.
know about famous, they always, there's always this conflict between like the great man theory of history. We tell story through, large figures that did huge movements.
Great man or woman.
Yeah, great man or woman. But then then there's I think there's the other theory where they're like going through via social issues and cultural issues that drove history. And there's always a like conflict about those. But really, like, what do you walk out in high school knowing?
Right.
You're right. A lot of U.S. history. You hope you know the history from essentially 1700 to 2000s.
Right, and that's always covered really deeply in schools.
It's like 300 years of history there, and then really broad brushstrokes of everywhere else.
Right.
And there's huge swaths of the world that I remember we never touched, like Asia, little to no
Asia
there.
or Africa.
Or Africa.
Very little.
A lot of Europe, but a lot of Europe was covered in kind of a world history class. And it was covered in depth there.
But it was mostly European. It should have been called European history because it was not really world history.
Well, and it was
South America also not covered.
More than anything, it was like Greeks, Romans, and then there was a break until Charlemagne, and then from Charlemagne it was
did Middle Ages stuff.
Very lightly through the Middle Ages,
England,
and then it was really like
and stuff.
Trying to race you to the colonial period in the 1500s. Once you got to the 1500s,
Renaissance,
then it was like straight Renaissance. And then straight into U.S. history. And
that
was really the bulk of everything. Right?
I remember some British Industrial Revolution stuff.
Yeah.
But there was definitely a lot left out, which is a real challenge. And so that's one of the things, even if you decide to do a 4-year history cycle, doing a unit study approach can be a cool add-on between levels or something where you're like, I'm going to go ahead and focus on an area that's, not well covered in the curriculum, or is not well covered usually in history education, which would be a great thing to do. And I think if you do these unit studies and they're well thought out and they align with some interests of your learners, have some hands-on projects and things, that might be more impactful. I have a very great memory at this point of the French Revolution because I had to do this big team project and we actually built a big Bastille out of it. And I have this really in-depth memory of this project and all about it. So
one day more.
Oh yeah, I know. Don't get me started.
Don't get you started.
So these are really, unit studies are engaging. They're really customizable, which is great. The only problem is your continuity because you're hopping around between different time periods and different subjects. So,
and that's kind of that living history approach where you're kind of viewing things through snapshots of people in the time.
Yeah, I like that idea. It's like, so it's unit study-ish, except that you're using biographies or historical fiction or autobiographies, things written to get you in the perspective of the people that lived at that time, which I think is a really cool way to go. And there's so many great books now too. Obviously, a lot of it's not written in their own words, especially the older you get, but you can get books that are written from the perspective of a person. And then History Quest and their little history hops, right? They do that from their perspective, which is cool.
Well, and I'm kind of doing this personally myself right now, going through huge swaths of history in this more of a kind of living history approach. But I find knowing the underlying history, I kind of like start with the plot of what happened in that time frame, plus or minus the 50 years before and after the time. So it sets the stage and then it closes it out. So I get the history there, and then I do these biographies of individuals within that time frame. And you're absolutely right. It's a very strong way of learning. Like if if I'm reading like American history, I think I'm right up there. The British Are Coming by Atkinson. So I read that about the Revolutionary War, and you get the window of that time period. Maybe even layer in McCullough's like 1776, and you get a pretty good idea of what happens there. And now I go back and read a biography on Adams, go read a biography on Jefferson, read a biography on Washington that I'm doing right now. and you get some real nice perspective of the movements of those times and the key people and what they were thinking, and then you can maybe dive into some smaller topics that might be interest you. And you're right, that's getting those snapshots, but you do need that underlying base because you need to reference it somewhere. Sometimes if I just grab a book about some topic that I haven't really understood, like the time and place, you feel a little unmoored at the beginning of like, where am I talking about? When am I talking about? Who are these people?
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden you go, okay, I understand what I'm doing. Now I've put it in the right context. So there's that challenge between, am I going to learn about this person or this event and then not know really much about what's going around it? It can feel a little awkward. I just read a book called The Wager, which was about the Spanish-British War that happened in like the 1730s or 40s or 50s, somewhere in that time frame. And it was a war. It was called the War of Someone's Ear or something like that. Someone had their ear cut off or something, and they went to war over it. But basically, this boat went and got shipwrecked, and it was a really cool story. But like I didn't really have a good perspective of the time and the relationship. It was just like right into the book about the boat and getting shipwrecked. And it was really quick. There wasn't that much. So I felt a little unmoored about it, but I was able to experience and appreciate the time frame and the period and the experiences of those people. But I felt a little disconnected from maybe the greater geopolitical ramifications of, what this book was acting within. Yeah.
I think it could be really valuable to have living history books. It provides us emotional connection.
It really
that you
does,
can really, more than facts and figures and this battle and that king. And, if you can read something that has that perspective, there was a couple of books that we did in Ancients, the one about the scribe, I remember, a couple that were living history books. And those ones I think were the most impactful.
I think it was like Nakat, the scribe. He was the Egyptian scribe.
Yeah.
And
there's one more.
The golden bowl, which was this, I think it was the Sumerian.
Mesopotamian, was it?
It was Mesopotamia. Yeah, but it was like the golden bowl, a Mesopotamian story, but it was set in ancient Sumer, and the boy was like an apprentice gold worker or something like that. It was really good. It was so well done.
So, you definitely can do living books within a history cycle or within a unit study. I mean, you can put them in anywhere, but you could just base your entire history studies off of just using living books and studying about those time periods. And you can kind of dovetail that into like a chronological version, a unit study version. You can do it however you'd like to, but I think it's a great way to maintain a connection. Sometimes you can, lose the forest for the trees. So you have to be a little bit cautious that you're not just narrowing in on one person's experience at that time, but you're getting kind of a holistic view. But I think we have to ask ourselves, like, at the end of the day, what do we want our kids to walk out of high school understanding? Like, at what level?
Well, maybe even more so, what do you want them to know? And also, how do you want them to think about certain, not like what to think, but how to think about things and how to analyze critically,
right. How to learn
and all that type of thing. I think those skills is what we're looking for. With obviously the dates and figures and important people.
Yeah, we need to have a general understanding of it, but how much do we want them to remember dates, for example?
They don't need to know about Napoleon's generals, even though they were, great generals or whatever, the field marshals. They don't need to know about all that.
I think understanding, being able to memorize dates and things for some assessments as a skill to use later in college and things when they have to memorize things or at their jobs,
or
whatever.
when they get their Jeopardy shot.
Sure. But like the rest of it, I don't think that stuff, memorizing a bunch of information, I don't think should be the point. And I know a lot of times in classes I took in public school, it was all about memorizing the data, not really connecting to the themes.
Well, and I think the only thing I think the amount of memorization is probably proportional to their potential to need to recall that.
Right.
Like, are they going to need to recall, the names or people of, kingdoms in feudal areas of this, area of Europe or whatever? They don't need to know that, but do they need to know who presidents are? Do they need to know when the Civil War was? Do they need to know when, with respect to, slavery and this and that stuff? They're going to need to know those things because those are contextual pieces of history and information that they may be called upon to recall within polite conversation, within society.
And we have to learn from the past, right?
All that type of stuff.
And the stuff that's happened more in the more modern sense. And I think that's why even
that's why I think a lot of people kind of maybe we'll criticize it like it's a very American centric, but that's because they're going to be asked in conversations and public life and engaging with other people to recall that information because that's contextually important based on what's happening today and that type of stuff.
Well, and we need to understand our own history really well to, not repeat history and learn from mistakes and things. So I think it's really important. So whatever country you're in, obviously, studying your own country is going to be a big focus for parts of your history cycle. And it's funny, even though we talk about Build Your Library as saying they really do 2 of the 4-year history cycles, they don't really, because even in high school, they do a couple of years of U.S. history again. So it's a truncated, it's like 1.5 history cycles.
Well, I'd actually love to know if you got any European listeners or anyone else overseas, in your country, what is the expectations of history there? Because like we're very American centric, so we all think about our history and then we get loose understandings of like, okay, here are the famous French kings and Charlemagne, and that's about all I know, and that type of stuff. Like, how much in their country are you taught about American history? Is it little? Is it maybe like a couple key points and here's a couple famous presidents and that type of stuff?
Or is it, years of...
I'd love to know. Yeah, put it in the comments below.
I'm sure it's years of studying your own country's history. I know, and for us...
How many years do you have to study our history?
Usually,
it should be at least 4 or 5 years.
It's like 4th or 5th grade too, where we usually do state history. The state history is also a piece. Yeah. So trying to put all these in here can be difficult. It does lead us to the last option for your history planning. You could do a geographic or a cultural history study. So instead of following a timeline, you can focus on history by region and say, okay, this is the whole history of
North America
or South America or Asia or whatever. And you can narrow in however you want, but you can really look at the evolution of culture and civilization, in the lens of that region. So I think that can be really cool, especially if you have cultural background. Maybe you live here now, but you're originally from Brazil or somewhere like that, and you want to just really dive in and make sure your students have a great understanding of where their family is from and the history of that area. You could do something like that. I think it's great, provides a deeper understanding, but it can be difficult to understand like the big picture historical stuff, right? So many civilizations and cultures have influence on each other. So to view them in a vacuum kind of thing could be challenging. You may have to give inputs from other places, like, okay, this is what came into this section. So those are a couple of options beyond the 4-year. I think this whole subject is a little bit difficult because every one of these time periods, every one of these places in that time or peoples in that time is an entire PhD. So trying to figure out how we're going to narrow it down and give our kids just the information that we think is relevant to their lives and that they would be, is general information they need to know and information to focus on is really, really a big challenge.
Well, and it's also funny because, we're American centric here with our kids and our thinking. And our history goes back 400 years, right? And
colonial American history,
colonial American history.
Our other history goes back way further.
Way far.
For native history.
But it's funny if you're European and you live in Italy, and your history goes back 10, 20, 30,000 years, or if you're like there's the Lascaux caves in France, and how far back do you want your history to go? We just don't have that like perspective here.
Yeah, I think that's true. We don't.
And in a lot of places, like, if you're if I'm from India or if I'm from China, like your history goes back 10,000, 20,000 years, right? It's incredible how deep and rich that location is,
right,
and how many people have been there. Obviously, we have kind of native peoples element that's been here for thousands, but that's not something that we identify with, and so. Like that obviously is a real thing, and we do teach that. But that is not.
We don't have as much documentation though.
Yeah, there's not as much there
to go back as far as they can in say Europe. There is a lot to teach, but it's not to the depth of European or African or Asian history that we just the documentation wise we just don't have that. So
and I think that goes into like what is the right approach for a family.
Yeah, it can be so hard to decide. I mean, I think it depends on your interests, your child's interests, their learning style, your family learning style and approach. Are you a book heavy type of family? So you would love all the living history books, and, are you more of a project based unit study type family because your kids are going to get bored, moving through history like this? They'd be much better off saying, we're going to look at the history of flying machines. And this is going to be our whole unit study. And we're going to go all the way back. And then we're going to learn how the evolution of different flying machines or whatever it is. Right.
Sure.
So, pick an approach that works for you. I don't think you have to stay in the strict 4-year cycle if you don't want to. Like, if that doesn't work for you, we like Build Your Library. We like that structure. But if you want more flexibility, you don't want as much structure, or you want a really deep dive, we're just going to go chronologically the whole way through, and we're all just going to do this together. I think there's no right way to do it. Like I say, every one of these subjects, micro subjects, are PhD worthy. So it's going to be tough. It's going to be tough. And there's a lot of materials out there to use. So give some thought to what might work best for your family.
So, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about maybe what's going to happen next week when we talk about, bringing in multiple students and doing this.
So assuming you're going to use the 4-year history cycle, you want to do like a Build Your Library type thing.
And for a lot of families, who are eclectic, we still make choices on curriculums, and we're very much, Build Your Library. We also love Blossom and Root and that stuff. So we are choosing to Build Your Library. We went through the ancient civs, we paused, came back, reset,
with our
younger, and now we're going forward. And as we move forward, now we're going to be adapting the curriculum to account for an older learner. And we're going to be talking about that next week. And even though we have decided to go Build Your Library, there's a lot of families out there who just said, listen, she's got 12 years of this curriculum ready to go. I'm just going to stay here. My kid likes it. We like reading books. We're a book family. We're going to make those decisions. Right? You don't have to go and be complex and it's super eclectic.
But when you have
piece it together, it is nice to have that all done for you.
It is nice, but when you have more kids, how do you? I get this. The reason we originally did this was because I had a lot of people email me and ask like, how would you do, Build Your Library with multiple kids? Like, what level do you go with? Where do you start? How does it work?
This has been a question that's been asked for years now.
It has been. And that's why we wanted to just take this episode and explain, what the premise is behind the cycle, and give you some food for thought ideas if that's not what you want to do. And then next week, we're going to talk about, if you're going to use, and Build Your Library is just going to be our, example standard. How would you structure the levels with multiple kids? What are your options? Because there's a few different ways that you can go, and give you some ideas for how you can do a family-based learning approach. Because I think some of y'all who do 2 levels of Build Your Library at once are rock stars. I'm not capable of it. We have to all be on one level to rule them all because I can't handle it. Otherwise, it's just too much. I couldn't do like ancients with one kid and U.S. history with the other. It would just, I would not survive.
One of the children is going to be the anchor that they're
right.
I got 3. Congratulations, middle kid. We're following your age range.
So we're going to talk about all the different options and kind of pros and cons of each next week. So stay tuned if that's your jam. Thanks so much for joining us today and making us a part of your homeschool journey. Please engage with us on social media. Join our Homeschool Together podcast group on Facebook and find us at Homeschool Together Podcast on Instagram. We'd love to hear your feedback, questions, and recommendations. Until next time.
Happy homeschooling!